Russia and Afghanistan. In the year 1979, Prime Minister Hazifullah Amin tried to sweep away Muslim tradition in the government of Afghanistan in an attempt to westernize it. This was because he was a communist, and communism doesn't like religion that challenges the government.
Amin's actions outraged Muslims across Afghanistan. In response to this, the Mujahideen was formed. The Mujahideen was an Islamic guerrilla fighting group who declared a jihad, or a holy war, against all members who supported Amin's regime. This threat was extended to members of the Russian troops who had been sent to aid the communist regime.
The goal of the Mujahideen was to overthrow the communist government and restore Islamic law. The Russian troops were there to maintain the communist government beginning and on December 24th, 1979, which is Christmas. They thought that the Mujahideen were a group of guerrilla fighters that were weak and ineffective, and a bunch of terrorists, which they were proved to be wrong.
The fresh troops deployed from Russia were no match for the conditions that they faced in the Afghan mountains. Tanks and armored infantry were completely useless on the mountain passes. The guerrilla fighters knew the terrain very well. Even though they used old rifles and old tactics, they knew the terrain as if it were the back of their hand, thus completely crippling any Russian troops. The situation quickly turned into a Russian version of the Vietnam War. Many Soviet tactics were proved ineffective and useless, such as their aircraft, which used napalm, machine guns, and poison gases. These tactics proved to be ineffective and completely useless. Kemal's position depended entirely on the Russian military support. After Afghan soldiers deserted to the Mujahideen, his forces were left drastically depleted. He had 85,000 Soviet troops stationed in his area. Even that proved futile, as by 1982 the Mujahideen was controlling 75% of Afghanistan after the fighting. The situation in Afghanistan was further complicated when the UN tried to force Russia into retreating its forces and recalling all of its activities in Afghanistan. A Security Council hearing was called, and Russia vetoed that calling. The USA caused further complications by boycotting the Olympics in Moscow in 1980. As well as the SALT talks, which were meant for disarmament, were also immediately halted, canceling any hope of peace between Russia and the US during the 1980s. Afghan soldiers were trained by American forces and given anti-aircraft weaponry by Americans. These would ultimately lead to further problems when the Mujahideen split between the original Mujahideen and the Taliban, who had been trained and prepped to fight by Americans themselves.
The Russians had their own version of a draft. Young people of Russia were forced into military service in something called they were called conscripts, and they were put against the trained Afghan rebels who were zealots, not compromising in battle. They quickly proved an ineffective fighting force against the strong local dug-in natives. Mikhail Gorbachev withdrew troops by the end of the 1980s from Afghanistan. They admitted to the public that they could not win the war with Russia's weak economy and with an enemy so strong and aided by American forces. They had been keeping the situation of the war from the people in the same way the American government kept the information about the war from people during Vietnam.
End of the 1980s, a civil war between the Mujahideen and the Taliban had broken out. The Taliban wanted to increase Islamic law and put on strict limitations on religious freedoms. The Taliban came out on top in the end and ruled the country until the USA removed them from power using armed forces.
Recently in 2000, a Russian soldier was found living among the Afghan people. He had diverted to the other side after deserting his position in the Russian army. He was happy to be living among the people and did not want to be found by modern reporters. Recently, in the
Russian
past,
troops were not ready for the conditions
recently in
of
the past few
mountains.
years, an
The
Afghan soldier
situation
was found
quickly
living in
regressed into
Afghanistan.
a Russian version of Vietnam.
Recently, in the 2000s,
Napalm,
an Afghan
tanks, and
Russian.
poison gases.
Recently, in the 2000s, a Russian soldier was found living among the Afghan people. He had become a medicine man and converted to Islam. He deserted the Russian army after he felt like the Mujahideen were withdrew troops by the end of the 1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev withdrew. They admitted to the public that they could not win the. Where are we? Mikhail Gorbachev withdrew troops. By the end, the Russians had their own version of communism. Doesn't like religion that challenges the public that they could not win in Afghanistan.
US during the Amin's actions outraged Muslim protests. Afghan soldiers were trained by Americans. These would ultimately lead.